Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Western Heritage Center. My name is Kevin Koistra, and I want to welcome you to another third Thursday high noon lecture. I know a couple people in the audience actually knew Willard Fraser personally. We might hand him a mic after, but I actually have seen that happen. Sue Hart, one time I was working with her, and I did the flood of 37, and she said, "Does anybody have any stories?" And about an hour and a half later, we got out of there. So maybe one person, Mr. Bollinger. So anyway, we're here to hear the story of Willard Fraser, an amazing character, I guess you could say. And Lou Mandler is here to give that presentation. But our next program, third Thursday, September 21, Bothersome Bacilli, Measly Mites, and Vexing Viruses, Livestock Disease in Montana's Ranching History. Dr. Kerry Clements coming down from Bozeman. Thursday, October 19, a history of the St. Vincent Healthcare panel session, which is actually going to address the changes that are going on right now at the hospital as it becomes Intermountain Health. And then on November 16, our local celebrity photography of Larry Mayer. So Larry will come in and talk about the photography, and he might play the Tom Cruise tape again. I don't know, was anybody here for the Larry Mayer reception? Well, trust me, you might want to come for it because he has this incredible phone message from Tom Cruise, who he apparently upset at one point. So anyway, so we have great sessions coming. We have a couple more walking tours. The schedules are up there also, and we also have our exhibit, Vietnam Voices, is on display at the public library. I know Deanne's not there, but she'll always be the library. Anyway, so that's through the end of August. So that's firsthand accounts from Vietnam vets about their experience in Vietnam, and like I said, it's one of our 16 traveling displays that we have out there. So. Without further ado, I wanted to mention our sponsor for today's program, Visit Billings. We appreciate their support, and they help us to offset some of our costs to bring these speakers. We can actually pay very nominally our speakers to come and present, which apparently is a novelty in Montana to even be paid for a program. So Willard Fraser was a charismatic mayor of Billings during the 1960s and early 1970s. His reach and impact lay far beyond the borders of the Magic City. Fraser brought vision and energy to the mayor's office, using it as a platform to promote Billings and Montana to the world. He tackled air and water pollution, cleaned up urban blight, and ensured that women, youth, and minorities were not marginalized. He championed Montana's history, cultural heritage, and tourism potential. And anybody who has Fraser stories, you'll hear, so I told these young ladies over here about one down in the hallway, but so I'm really anxious to hear Lou Mandler's work. She spent a lot of time putting this book together and learning the story of Willard Fraser. Author Lou Mandler grew up on a wheat and cattle farm in northeastern Montana. After graduating from Montana State University, she taught in Alberta and Idaho before attending the Bredlow School of English at Middlebury College in Vermont. There, she earned a master's degree and met her husband, who is here also. They have since lived in Connecticut. During her career at the Canterbury School in Connecticut, she received the Geraldine R. Dodge Fellowship for secondary school teachers, a grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities Seminar in Native American Literature, and the Joseph Klingenstein Fellowship to Teachers College of Columbia University. Now retired from education, Lou retains an interest in the family farm in Sheridan County and visits Montana on a regular basis. I think this is her third or fourth presentation in Yellowstone County in the last couple of years. And if one of your friends wants to see a live performance of Lou, she'll be back in late September for the Yellowstone Historical Society to present the story of Mayor Willard Fraser. Without further ado.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm almost beginning to feel like Billings is my second home, and it's partially, I think, because of my work with Willard Fraser. I got to know Billings people and Billings very well. And I'm delighted to see Jim Thompson and John Bollinger here because they both helped immensely in putting this book together. Jim Thompson gave me hours of interviews and told me many stories.
Hey Lou,
yeah.
you might have to bring the mic right up to your lips.
Okay.
Like pretend you're a rapper or something.
Okay, is this better?
That's better.
Okay, yeah. I don't have a great voice anyway, so let me know. Raise your hand if you can't hear me if I get sloppy. All right, the subject of this talk I decided was the many faces of Willard Fraser, which I stole actually from a newspaper article written by Addison Bragg, because it demonstrates the multifaceted faces of Willard Fraser. It's really difficult to describe him in one sentence. You know, he was most commonly referred to as colorful. In the paper yesterday, he was referred to as problematic, which I'm sure his city council would have agreed with. So he was many things. He loved people, he loved fun, he loved Montana, he loved Billings, and he was an expert at drawing attention to his state and to himself. He brought Montana to the world and the world to Montana. He was a favorite subject of journalists, and he was amazingly relevant to today's world, which is why visionary is in the title of the book. As a segue into Fraser's first face, that of a Frost relative, I'm going to explain how I got interested in Willard Fraser. It was through this photo, which I came across in a book of essays on little-known information about America's greatest writers. This is poet Robert Frost with his granddaughter, Robin Fraser, at Robin's high school graduation in Billings. Since my book has come out, I've become aware that many people in Billings have only a vague knowledge of the Frost-Fraser connection. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about that, because it was an important part of his identity, and Billings was frequently the location of Frost-Fraser interactions. Willard was born in Kansas, and his parents moved to Billings in 1913, seeking a better climate for 6-year-old Willard's asthma, which was a condition that plagued him throughout his life. Willard's parents, Sadie and Jack Fraser, moved their family around Billings for a few years. And these are today's photos of some of the houses that they rented on North 31st, on Clark Street, and Wyoming Avenue, until they finally settled at 118 South 38th Street in 1932. The Frasers struggled financially, and Willard didn't go to college immediately after he graduated from Billings High School in 1926. However, thanks to the encouragement of high school English teacher Isabella Price and fundraising by his family, Willard entered the University of Colorado at Boulder a year later. It was a fortuitous decision, one that determined much about the connections, outlook, and interests of this future mayor, who often said he was not city limited. While Willard was working at the cafeteria at the university, he encountered archaeologist Earl Morris, who was working at Colorado's Museum of Natural History, and who had established a reputation as one of the nation's foremost archaeologists through his excavation work in Arizona's Canyon de Chelly. Willard, perpetually gregarious and eager for interesting experiences, talked his way into Morris's summer digging crew. The several summers he spent on archaeology digs cemented his interest in history and native cultures, and was also a path to his marriage. Dwight Morrow Jr. was a colleague on the Southwest digging crew. Morrow's father was associated with Amherst College, where Robert Frost was teaching, and the Morrows and the Frosts were friendly. Incidentally, Dwight Morrow Sr. was also the father of Anne Morrow Lindbergh. In 1931, Robert and Eleanor Frost's youngest daughter, Marjorie, was diagnosed with tuberculosis and at the urging of friends in Boulder, they sent her to Mesa Vista Sanatorium in Boulder. Willard's friend Dwight then wrote to Willard and suggested that he look Marjorie up. Willard soon wrote tomorrow, "I have been to see her a time or two. She is most interesting and has as fascinating a face as I have ever seen on a young girl." Nearly a year later, Marjorie wrote to her parents to announce her engagement to Willard. She called him a dear, kind, and considerate man, another real Victorian papa, with the beautiful ideals I learned no longer existed or I feared. And Frost responded, "Willard sounds like a good boy in a sad world. Bless you both." A few months later, the Frosts came to Colorado and met their future son-in-law. This was a meeting that Willard looked forward to with pleasant excitement, but also some anxiety. Robert Frost was already famous and came from a literary, intellectual environment in New England after spending time in England. Willard Fraser came from a small city in a rural state, and his family struggled to make ends meet. But Willard, being Willard, hit it off with the Frosts to the point that Frost once wrote to him, "You're the only son-in-law I ever cared for." It was a relationship that endured. Willard needed a job before he and Marjorie married, and it took some time for him to land one in the Depression years. He finally found employment with Western Progressive, a Helena newspaper, and after a year's engagement, the couple could plan a wedding. In the spring of 1933, Marjorie took a train from Massachusetts to Billings, and their wedding took place in the Fraser home at 118 South 38th. The Frosts did not attend, but Frost wrote, "The day of the wedding, I will do nothing but think of you." Willard and Marjorie lived at first in an apartment in Helena, but they spent much time traveling around the state when Willard took a new job with the Internal Revenue Office. Some letters from Marjorie during this time can be found in the Frost archives in Dartmouth and the University of New Hampshire. They leave no question but that she was very much in love with Willard Fraser. One of my favorites was written from Massachusetts as she was waiting for Willard to land a job, but he was nevertheless running for mayor. She writes, "Dearest, of course I think you're crazy, but that's nothing new. I've always known you were. However, don't let that worry you. I like crazy people. Safe and sane people don't interest me in the least, and I simply can't endure snobbish, conservative, superior-minded people, especially men. And if they show any sign of being afraid, they are simply unspeakable. But I love you, so I'm sure you must be crazy and divinely wise, too." Willard and Marjorie returned to Billings to a small apartment at 244 Burlington Avenue in the late winter of 1934 to await the birth of their baby. When Robin Fraser was born on March 16, 1934, at the hospital that was a precursor to Billings Clinic, Eleanor Frost was in Billings with her daughter. And what Marjorie, Willard, and the Frosts went through in the next nearly 2 months was horrible, tragic, and sadly could have been prevented. Marjorie's attending doctors did not at first recognize that she was suffering from childbed fever, and instead they had her drink 20 glasses of liquid a day, and they gave her 12 blood transfusions. Both Eleanor and Robert Frost returned to Billings to be with their daughter, and numerous letters from both parents expressed their agony as they feared her death but hoped desperately for her survival. This letter, which is not in the book, was written by Robert Frost in Billings to his son Carol, and it describes their awful vigil. To read excerpts. "Marjorie's sickness is that worst disease of all, childbed fever. and her chances of recovery are small. Our best hope is her having lasted as long as she has. Marjorie has stood it a month and 3 days now. Several times she's been at the point of death. Nothing has kept her alive so far but blood transfusions. Willard's friends have come forward in a host to give their blood for her. I never imagined anything like it for kindness and friendship. I try not to give way to hope or fear. I am simply determined in my soul and bones or somewhere that our side shall win. Yesterday was one of her most desperate days. Today she has rallied again after another blood transfusion. She has 3 splendid nurses. She is keeping it up with a noble courage which breaks our hearts. Eleanor can hardly bear it. The thing to keep saying is the longer Marge holds on, the likelier she is to pull through. In a final desperate attempt to save their daughter, the Frosts had Marjorie flown to Mayo Clinic on April 26. They and Willard followed by automobile. It was too late. Marjorie died there on May 2, 6 weeks after Robin's birth. Her funeral was in Billings, and she's buried in Mount View Cemetery, although her name is also on the Frost tomb in Burlington, Vermont. In the time after Marjorie's death, Eleanor Frost and Willard's grief was nearly unendurable. Eleanor wrote to a friend, "I cannot bear it, but I must bear it for the sake of the others here." Willard sought refuge in work in the Southwest with Earl Morse, who, he said, saved my sanity. I learned recently of a letter here in Billings owned by Carrie Purcell, granddaughter of Marion Purcell, one of the Billings nurses who attended Marjorie during her illness. And it speaks to Willard's and Eleanor's grief. The letter from Eleanor to Mrs. Purcell reads in part, "My son-in-law is going about an archaeological work in New Mexico and Arizona, and it is difficult for me to communicate with him. He has been, and still is, terribly distracted and upset, and he may easily have made a mistake in your case. And I have decided to pay the bill for him, and you have gone without your money all this time. I am extremely sorry. I appreciated the way you nurses worked to save my daughter's life. Poor, darling child, if only it could have come out differently." After Marjorie's death, Eleanor made sure granddaughter Robin was a part of their lives. The Frosts cared for Robin in her first months, while Willard worked in the Southwest. But even after Robin was established on South 38th with Willard and his mother Sadie, and this is a picture of Sadie much later, but I had to have a picture of her because she was a great lady. Eleanor arranged to have Robin with them for extended periods. Robin was with the Frosts in Florida in March 1938 when Eleanor died of a heart attack. She also spent time with Carol Frost's widow Lillian and the Frost's eldest daughter Leslie. When Robin was a student at Smith College, she was geographically close to her Frost family, and Robert attended her college graduation. As Robert Frost's granddaughter, Robin participated in some significant national and literary events. She and her husband, David Hudnut, attended Frost's 85th birthday celebration in New York City. And in 1962, she and David were invited to John Kennedy's inauguration when Robert Frost recited his poem, The Gift Outright. Both the Hudnuts and Willard attended Frost's private funeral service in 1963. By the way, Robin is still a very vital 89-year-old living in California. And when I spoke at Red Lodge last fall, she and 2 of her children were there. She's quite a woman. Robin went to the Frosts, but the Frosts also came to Billings. A notable incident is Robert Frost's participation in Robin's high school graduation in 1952. To accord proper attention to their famous guests, the school arranged 2 nights of ceremonies, one night to give out diplomas and one night to hear him speak. He spoke at Eastern and Rocky Mountain while he was in Billings as well. Over the decades, numerous other Frosts visited Billings. Carol's widow, Lillian, spent 3 weeks with the Frasers in 1962, and she wrote about an entertaining evening in the Frost home, hearing J.K. Ralston and A.D. Guthrie tell stories. On this postcard to Robert Frost, picturing individual Native chiefs, Lillian wrote, "Willard has been feeding me Montana history. We visited Custer Battlefield, and these are some of the Indians who fought here." Her son Prescott visited the Frasers. Leslie Frost came to Billings once to speak at an NEA convention, and her grandson Douglas Wilbur attended the University of Montana under Willard's influence, and Doug was one of the pallbearers at Willard's funeral. Throughout Willard's time as mayor, he used Frost's poetry to help express his thoughts and emotions. He quoted, "Never again would bird songs be the same, or choose something like a star," in letters of condolence to parents who lost their sons in the Vietnam War. He wrote to one set of bereaved parents, "It will help just a little in helplessly trying to explain the unexplainable. Sometimes there's nothing left but poetry and God." He used the Frost poem, "A Soldier," in the eulogy he delivered when President Kennedy died, and he read the Silken Tent at marriages that he performed, and the Burgess was on his own funeral program. In sum, that Willard was Robert Frost's son-in-law was a significant part of his identity. It also opened doors to connections and perceptions beyond Montana. Everything okay? Okay. Oh, okay. It also opened doors to connections and perceptions beyond Montana, contributing to the formation of Billings mayor as an American at large, as well as a citizen of Billings. But of course, Willard was much more than a Frost relative. That he was a veteran of World War II was also part of his identity. He enlisted in 1942 at the age of 35 and spent nearly 5 years in the 8th Infantry Division, much of it as a medic in Europe. And this experience gave him a global perspective, and it deepened his humanitarian instincts. I'm afraid that in the years from 1933 to 1963, Willard also earned the label failed candidate. Between 1933 and 1963, he ran for office 13 times and lost every election until he became mayor in 1963. He ran for mayor, state representative, governor, commissioner of railroad and public service, and representative to the US Congress. His losses could be attributed partially to the fact that he was a Democrat in a deeply Republican area. Sometimes he just really didn't campaign because of illness, but also he was often viewed more as a character than a serious politician. Newsmen often focused on his colorful reputation rather than on campaign issues. When he ran for governor, one reporter commented, "It's difficult to know whether he's running for poet laureate or governor." However, his losses could not be contributed to a lack of determination, optimism, confidence, or resilience. He had those qualities in abundance, and a sense of humor. After each of his failed campaigns, Willard returned to his career as a lobbyist. A decades-long cause was Yellowtail Dam. He advocated for its construction both in Montana and in Washington. He traveled to Washington several times to testify for its construction. And these efforts continued even after he became mayor. As part of his promotion of dams, this asthmatic mayor and kind of unathletic mayor undertook several exploratory float trips down Montana rivers, notably the Flathead and the Bighorn. He embraced such adventures, and it was important to him to share these experiences with his friends, and he had scores. In 1965, just before construction on the dam began, the National Park Service organized a float trip down the Bighorn River to identify potential recreational opportunities. The Park Service invited Willard and Grant Salisbury, a Fraser friend who worked for the U.S. News and World Report magazine, along with the representatives of the Crow tribe, the mayor of Lovell, Wyoming, and representatives of Wyoming and Montana Fish and Game departments. When Willard showed up, he brought his friends, Dr. Donald Haar, Stuart Connor, and Charles Borberg and his son Bob. When park officials tried to send Willard's uninvited friends home, Willard would have nothing to do with it. Stuart Connor remembered, Willard wouldn't have even the slightest hint of accommodating the government. If he was going somewhere and going to have some fun, he wanted to have his friends there. By God, those were his friends, and he was going to take them with him. In the end, Fraser's friends stayed. In 1963, Willard ran for mayor for the 6th time, and Willard Fraser finally became mayor of Billings. This was the beginning of nearly 8 years when Mayor Fraser worked to get Billings going, to preserve Montana history, and to make Montana a destination. During these years, he himself became an occasional national figure and a regular fodder for in-state newspapers. Willard was always quotable. When choosing quotes to head each chapter of this book, I had to omit numerous Fraserisms. One of his favorites, while others endure weather, Billings enjoys climate, didn't make it as a chapter heading, but it did serve time on the mayor's outgoing mail for a while. As mayor, Willard strove to preserve places of historic significance in Billings, and because he famously declared, "I am not city limited," in areas near Billings as well. Within weeks of his inauguration, he began to focus attention on Pompey's Pillar, when he petitioned the highway department to make sure the interstate would allow history-minded tourists easy access to the pillar. Just waiting for a shot of the pillar up here. A modern shot. As you know, William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition carved his name and the date, July 25, 1806, on the pillar. Willard wrote several letters to the National Park Service suggesting that Pompey's Pillar be designated a National Historic Landmark. Finally, Secretary of State Stuart Udall announced it would be designated as such on July 10, 1965. And in 2001, President Clinton ensured the pillar's preservation by declaring it a national monument. In the fall of 1963, Fraser began a campaign to preserve another national site outside the city limits, what were then called Indian Caves. His interest in the pictographs in the caves would have been intensified by his experience working in the digs in the Southwest. This project didn't always go smoothly. When he signed an agreement with the State Park Commission for Billings to administrate the cave's 22 acres, the city council erupted in objections because the caves were outside the city limits. This would not be the first time that Fraser clashed with the city council. But undeterred, he gained enough local support to establish a caves commission, the only one in the nation, he bragged, and to convince the U.S. Interior Department to designate Indian caves as a National Historic Landmark in 1964. Willard then proudly announced that the site would be added to the list of tourist attractions in Montana. In 1991, Pictograph Caves became a state park, and a plaque in the Visitor Center commemorates Fraser's contribution to preserving the cave, and it lists the members of the Cave Commission. In 1964, in still another outside the city limits project, he conceived of a mayor's float to celebrate the beauty and history of what at 692 miles is the longest undammed river in America. The Yellowstone float trip would float the river 126 miles from Livingston to Billings, beginning with just over 100 vessels the first year. It swelled to more than 1,000 floaters at one point, certainly due to Fraser's promotion. He invited Dr. Spock, poet John Ciardi, Clark Adrian, William Clark's great-great-grandson, and scores of others. Spock and Ciardi would come to Montana later, but Clark Adrian participated in 1966, and writer A.B. Guthrie and people from Colorado, Minnesota, Florida, and even Sweden joined in other years. In selling the idea of the float, Fraser wrote, "This is the hottest thing in recreation in America. For where is there a 3-day float of this magnitude and excitement?" Because of his salesmanship, the float was covered in the Chicago Tribune, the National Observer, the Saturday Evening Post, Pepsi-Cola's magazine, and the Denver Post. It continues today, right? But not with that publicity. Willard actively promoted another area site, the location of what was then called Custer's Last Stand. Fraser was always on the side of Native tribes, and this came into play in anything to do with Custer. He was one of the first to publicly declare that Custer was not a nice guy, as he would rail against the false perception of Custer as hero, as this news article verifies. When he invited President Johnson to the 1967 reenactment of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he wrote, "In white circles, it is known as the Custer Massacre, and in red circles as a great victory." Long before the battle was changed to the Battle of Little Bighorn, he wrote to the Board of Geographic Names to suggest the site be called Custer Sitting Bull Battlefield. Wouldn't that be more in keeping with the victor side of the case, he wrote? Fraser lent his support to another Custer-related project, the reburial of Major Marcus Reno from Custer's command. Reno's reputation had been under a shadow since he was accused of cowardly behavior for leading his men in a retreat across the river when outflanked by warriors. He could not have saved Custer and his men, and his retreat saved the lives of his own men. Reno had been buried in a nondescript grave in Washington, D.C. The campaign to bring his body to Custer National Cemetery began in 1966 and concluded with a ceremony in September 1967. Ever a lover of pageantry and big events, Fraser, in charge of the guest committee, issued scores of invitations to the reburial ceremony, including the editor of Life magazine, Hubert Humphrey, Burton K. Wheeler, and Senators Mansfield and Metcalf. He later described it as the flashiest funeral in years. Willard often bragged that Lewis and Clark spent more time in Montana than in any other state. And in another bow to his interest in Lewis and Clark, in May 1968, he attended the dedication of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, which represents the Montana portion of the expedition. He brought a Montana sagebrush to St. Louis and declared it would make the state smell a whole lot better. He also saw to it that Montana artist J.K. Ralston's painting, Into the Unknown, would be installed in the center. A PR man extraordinaire for Montana, Willard used both his personal charisma and his connections with the press to publicize Montana's charms. And he invited friends, strangers, and celebrities to come to Montana. His invitations could be relentless. After astronaut Scott Carpenter received a number of letters from Willard urging him to come to Billings, Carpenter said, "I couldn't decline under such pressure." Willard sought to put Billings and Montana on the map with considerable success. His knack for friendship paid dividends when he became a close friend of Grant Salisbury. In 1961, the Fraser-Salisbury friendship resulted in a U.S. News article entitled, "City Gets a Federal Building, but Does It Want One?" This was surely in support of Fraser's objection to constructing a building that would cause him to lose tenants in his own building. We know the result of this. The federal building stands and Willard's building does not. As mentioned, Salisbury accompanied Willard on a float trip down the Flathead River and the last float trip down the Bighorn River just before Yellowtail Dam construction began. Salisbury wrote an article that appeared in the U.S. News and Report after the float. In it, Fraser's influence is apparent. Salisbury's description of Billings as a sun-drenched city was surely a Fraser quote. In a later article on Western art, Salisbury gives due coverage to the Carter Museum in Fort Worth and paintings in St. Louis and other cities. But the focus on Montana artist Charlie Russell would certainly have been influenced by Willard. Willard also used his own pen to extol Montana's virtues and challenge any perceived slight Montana received in mainstream publications. When the Monitor radio show, broadcasting from Rockefeller Center, reported on Easter morning in 1966 that a howling blizzard is sweeping Montana, Fraser fired off a letter. Well, at Indian Caves, the meadowlark, that most melodious of songbirds, were pouring out their hearts. It was beautiful. And yet, Monitor is putting out that sort of weather nonsense. You should do something about it. Red Book, the Chicago Tribune, the Saturday Evening Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and Harper's all received scoldings from Willard for printing something that he thought was unfavorable to Montana. Willard's active involvement in things statewide does not mean that he neglected his own city. His accomplishments as mayor are too numerous to mention or itemize, but he was instrumental in establishing the Boys Club, refurbishing local parks, planting trees, cleaning up outhouses and unsightly properties, updating zoning codes, securing a city bus system, and he worked tirelessly to address Billings' air pollution problem. As a chronic asthmatic, he was particularly sensitive about smoking, and he was ahead of his time in banning smoking from City Hall. Not all of Willard's attempts at improving life for Billings citizens were successful. The tunnel that he envisioned through the rims never materialized, nor the gravity flow water system, nor the Calamity Jane Reservoir. And he was defeated in his attempt to fluoridate Billings water. His opinion on the benefits of fluoridation was a strong one. Willard's history with his own illness, his boyhood experience with polio epidemics, and the 1918 flu, And the fact that his wife's death from childbed fever could have been prevented informed his belief in the wisdom of science. The prolonged fluoride war created much newspaper coverage, some of it humorous.
We have ghosts here.
Well, this next cartoon hits at the fact that fluoride improves the health of teeth, and so you have all these people in the audience clacking their false teeth and making noise, and of course it was a cartoon in favor of fluoridation. But that was it's fascinating reading newspapers accounts during that time, because everybody, It's fascinating to read newspaper accounts of the fluoride wars, because it went on for years, and everybody was very angry on both sides. And there was a lot of false information printed, and it really went on, and of course, Fraser was terribly disappointed when it was defeated. But continue. Okay. One of the things he commented about it was, he said, one of his quotable quotes, he says that the fluoridation war really brought the squirrels down from the trees, was the way he put it. And he was normally polite, but some of the letters that he wrote during the fluoridation war were pretty sharp and pretty impatient when he was responding to arguments against fluoridation. When Prevention magazine came out against fluoridation, he called it a fantastically nonsensical magazine and one of the most irresponsible magazines ever to be sold on the marketplace of America. And as we know, the public eventually voted against fluoridation. And it still doesn't have fluoridated water, right? Good, thank you. All right, next. Fraser led the city during the tumultuous years of the 1960s and the divisive effect of the Vietnam War. As a veteran and as a public official, he initially felt he should support the war, but as it continued, he struggled mightily with its consequences and the government's handling of it. The increasing number of war dead deeply affected him. He, or a representative, and I think one time it was James Thompson, attended every funeral of a young man from Billings who lost his life in Vietnam. He wrote letters of sympathy to every family who lost a soldier, and the flag flew at half-mast for every loss. With time and a recognition of government missteps, he changed his mind about supporting the war, and in his words, became a complete dove. In a letter he wrote to anti-war Senator Edmund Muskie, after Muskie appeared on 60 Minutes, Willard expressed his ambiguous views on the draft resistors of the time. He wrote, "Your television interview of Sunday brought to mind my boyhood in our Yellowstone Valley and Billings after World War I. We had many, many immigrant homestead in our valley from Germany, whose descendants now number some of our finest citizens. It was a very common thing for one of them to be pointed out as having been smart enough to have skipped out of Germany to evade the pre-war draft of the Kaiser. In my boyhood, they were considered to be very honorable men for having done as they did. Nowadays, the shoe is on the other foot, and it is some of our own men who have been skipping to Canada to evade the draft. Which is right and which is wrong? And when are they right and when are they wrong? That is the question that has no real answer then, nor has it now." The effect Willard exerted as a person was perhaps more enduring than his tangible legacies. He inspired affection, loyalty, and admiration. It's also true that he provoked some eye-rolling and frustration amongst the city council and others. But when I talked to his good friends, Stuart Connor, Jim Thompson, and John Bollinger, I was struck by the warmth they still felt towards Willard 50 years after his death. In an interview 10 years after Willard's death, Gazette columnist Addison Bragg spoke at length about his affection for Willard. And when I spoke recently at the House of Books, Mark Taylor said that as a young boy, he met Willard, and when they met again later, Willard remembered Mark's name. I've heard little anecdotes like that often in the process of writing this book. Gazette columnist Roger Clausen, who often criticized Willard in print, captured Willard's appeal when he wrote, "When my articles portrayed Fraser as a clown, it was because he was clowning. When my stories reported the mayor engaged in pressure politics, the mayor was engaged in pressure politics." Then he provided a portrait of my friend, the mayor, who is also a compassionate human being. He described Fraser spending Thanksgiving visiting people on Skid Row and families down on their luck. His article concluded, "What is more, he is the same man in all situations. I like the mayor because he doesn't cry. Politicians who wail that they are maltreated by the press and misunderstood by the public bore me. If Fraser were that sort of person, I wouldn't be writing this." An example of the compassionate human being that Clausen described is Willard's support for and friendship with those of Montana's native tribes. He understood the challenges Montana's tribes face, and he respected their culture and appreciated them as individuals. Soon after he became mayor, he gave a speech at Crow Days and took the trouble to have it translated into the Crow language, and he delivered it in that tongue. He worked with Cheyenne Chief Johnny Woodenlegs and Crow Chief Edison Realbird. He counted Susie Yellowtail as a good friend. He recorded numerous interviews with individual tribal people. They're now archived at the University of South Dakota, and here he's interviewing Joe Medicine Crow and Joy Tonita. Willard established his connections with people informally, but also formally, through writing and speaking gigs. He was a champion letter writer, sometimes writing as many 50 letters a day. His papers at MSU Billings occupy about 15 linear feet. And reading through his letters is inspiring and entertaining. Even his memos avoid the usual bureaucratic dullness. And this is just one example of many when he talked about every subject just you couldn't imagine. Neighbors are complaining about a dog in heat in the area of 22nd Street West between Colton and Lyman. The lady says that every he-dog in town is concentrated wishfully and hopefully in that area. Wishfully, because it seems the lady dog in question is fenced in. This is to the chief of police, Bevan. What can you do to alleviate the stress and strain of not only the he-dogs, but of the neighbors? In any event, do something. Thanks. He was in demand as a public speaker, and my own recent experience brought to mind a Willard speaking occasion that I could in no way match. Before I decided how to approach this talk, I had a dream. You know, it's like going back to school. I had a dream in which I was introduced, and I had no script, I had no computer, I had nothing to say. Well, Willard once was engaged to speak at a gathering that he thought was the Yellowstone Geological Society. He prepared something about Yellowtail Dam and Bighorn Canyon. When he got to the location, he thought, My golly, that's a funny-looking group of geologists. And in maybe a sexist but a realistic thing for the time, he thought maybe they decided to bring their wives. As he was introduced, he learned that he would be speaking to the Yellowstone Genealogical Society. He recalculated on the way to the podium and talked about his Scotch ancestors, Catholics, and the early Padres. I made out, he said. In June 1968, Willard went to Chicago for the U.S. Mayor's Conference. This was, of course, the year of the Democratic Convention riots, which he had something to say about too. Sorry, I'm not including that, but it happened at the same time. While at the Palmer Hotel, he fell and broke his hip. It was the beginning of a prolonged ordeal. He was hospitalized first in Chicago and then in Billings. And just as he was beginning to recover from the broken hip, he fell on the steps of the city hall and broke his kneecap. It required more months of convalescence, first in the hospital, then in a wheelchair, crutches, and finally a cane. He ran for his fourth term as mayor in April 1969. His months of ill health had taken its toll, and he did not look like a vital leader. One voter remarked before the election, "The best thing I can do for Willard is vote against him. He needs a rest." Willard lost. During his 2 off years, he enjoyed the fruits of a campaign he had begun as a mayor. He had successfully persuaded Stockbridge Productions to film the movie Little Big Man, starring Dustin Hoffman and Faye Dunaway, and directed by Arthur Penn on location in Montana. During the summer of 1969, Fraser was fully involved in serving as a resource to the producers. And of course, this very successful movie, the second highest grossing movie of 1971, brought more attention to Montana and to Willard. He always shrugged off criticism of his attention-getting ways as saying that any attention he brought to Montana and Billings, any attention he brought to himself, was also good for Montana and Billings. Before the next election in 1971, Fraser dedicated himself to improving his health through bicycle riding. His campaign manager, John Bollinger, used his bicycle riding as a symbol of a vigorous, healthy candidate. It worked. Willard soundly beat incumbent mayor Harold Hultgren, to earn his fourth term as mayor. In the next 16 months, Mayor Fraser continued to put Montana in the news. For instance, in the fall of 1971, during a Chamber of Commerce tour of the state, he blamed Charlie Russell's damn cow for giving Montana the reputation of having a frigid climate. Somehow, his comment was picked up by the press and it became a national story. He continued to bring national figures to Billings. He hosted Baltimore Mayor Thomas D'Alessandro, who's Nancy Pelosi's brother. He continued to accept any invitation to ride in a parade. He continued to raise awareness about environmental issues and make Billings more attractive and more efficient. On September 18, 1972, Willard wrote probably the last of his hundreds of letters to Raphael Elliman in Tel Aviv. He wrote, "Yellowstone Park is in our backyard, and I am going there tomorrow with the wife of President Nixon to tuck in the bears and turn off the geysers." On September 18, 1972, Yellowstone Park was 100 years old, and First Lady Pat Nixon and Interior Secretary Roger C.B. Morton stopped in Billings on their way to rededicate the park. Mayor Fraser, who loves ceremony, greeted them there and then accompanied them to the park. And these are the last photos taken of Mayor Willard Fraser after a cold, rainy day in the park with the Nixon entourage. The weather was not salubrious for an asthmatic mayor. He died that night in Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel at the age of 65. Pompey's Pillar and Pictograph Caves are among the tangible legacies of his efforts to preserve Montana's historic wonders. A more intangible legacy is that of a politician who worked selflessly for the good of his state, had a good time doing it, and earned the affection of his people. He died 50 years ago, but he foresaw many of the issues discussed today: the environment, gender, the right to bear arms, the role of science in government. He predicted the development of electric cars. Through it all, he radiated goodwill, met criticism with humor, and as he once said, he had no enemies, only friends who don't know me well. Are there questions, or does anybody have a question or a story? Okay. Right.
Excellent. Thank you. Well done. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you all. It was I had a great time with Willard. He's a lot of fun, and he made a difference. You know, he really he was more than fun. He also made a difference. I think sometimes we forget that because there were so many great stories, and that's wonderful. But we can't forget that he also did make a difference for Billings and Montana.